Moscow, December 25, 1991. Outside the Kremlin walls, the temperature is well below freezing. The streets are quiet, but inside, history is being made not with guns, not with bombs, but with a pen. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the most powerful communist state the world had ever seen, sits down and signs his resignation. A few hours later, the red Soviet flag, the hammer and sickle that had flown over the Kremlin for nearly 7 decades, is lowered for the last time. And just like that, the Soviet Union ceases to exist. No invasion, no nuclear war, no dramatic last stand. One empire, one decision, and the night that changed everything. But here is the question that historians, analysts, and ordinary people have been asking ever since. How did it really happen? How does a superpower that once challenged the United States, that put the first man in space, that commanded the loyalty of 15 republics and hundreds of millions of people, how does it simply collapse? The official story gives you dates and names, but the real story is far deeper. It starts not in 1991, but decades earlier. It starts with lies, with cracks, with a system slowly eating itself from the inside. This is the real story behind the collapse of the Soviet Union. To understand why the Soviet Union collapsed, you have to understand what it actually was, and more importantly, what it was pretending to be. On the surface, the USSR was a superpower. It had nuclear weapons by the thousands, it had a massive military, it had space programs, Olympic champions, and a seat at the table of every major world decision. It projected strength, confidence, and ideological certainty. To the outside world, it looked unbreakable. But underneath that surface, the foundation was crumbling. The Soviet economy was built on a single idea. The state controls everything. The state decides what gets produced, how much of it, at what price, and who gets it. In theory, it sounds efficient. In practice, it was a slow-motion catastrophe. Factories produced goods nobody wanted because they had quotas to meet, not customers to satisfy. Factory managers learned very quickly that the system rewarded numbers on paper, not actual quality or usefulness. A factory ordered to produce 10,000 pairs of shoes would produce 10,000 pairs, regardless of whether they fit anyone, regardless of whether the materials were good, regardless of whether anyone needed them. The goal was to meet the quota. The goal was never to serve the people. Farmers grew crops that rotted in fields because the distribution system was completely broken. Food would be harvested in one region and simply never reach the cities that needed it, not because there wasn't enough, but because the logistics of a centrally planned economy were too rigid, too bureaucratic, and too disconnected from reality to function properly. Store shelves were empty, while warehouses were full of the wrong things. Soviet citizens spent hours every day standing in lines for bread, lines for shoes, lines for meat, lines for basic necessities that people in the West took for granted. This was not occasional, this was daily life. This was the norm, and everyone knew it, even if no one was allowed to say it out loud. The Soviet Union had built an entire culture of silence around its failures. Criticism of the system was not just discouraged, it was dangerous. Journalists did not report on shortages. Economists did not publish data that contradicted the official narrative. Scientists who raised inconvenient truths disappeared from public life. The gap between what the government said was happening and what was actually happening grew wider every year. And while ordinary citizens were struggling, the Soviet government was spending an almost unimaginable amount of money on its military. At the height of the Cold War, the USSR was dedicating somewhere between 20 and 25% of its entire economy to defense. The United States, by comparison, was spending around 6%. This was not a competition the Soviet Union could win. Every ruble spent on missiles and tanks was a ruble not spent on hospitals, schools, roads, or food.
The arms race with America was not just a military competition, it was a slow financial hemorrhage that the Soviet system simply could not survive indefinitely.
And then came Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, expecting a quick and decisive victory. What they got instead was a 9-year war that killed tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers, drained billions from an already weakened economy, and shattered the myth of Soviet military invincibility. Soviet soldiers came home not as heroes, but as broken men carrying stories the government desperately tried to suppress. It became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a wound that would not close. Then came the oil crisis of the 1980s. The Soviet Union had become dangerously dependent on oil exports to fund its government and mask its economic failures. When global oil prices collapsed in the mid-1980s, the money that had been papering over all of these structural problems simply disappeared. The budget shortfalls became impossible to hide. The shelves got emptier, the lines got longer. The frustration of ordinary Soviet citizens turned into something darker, a deep, spreading distrust of the entire system. And then, on April 26, 1986, something happened that made everything worse. A reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine exploded. It was the worst nuclear disaster in human history. But the explosion itself was only part of the catastrophe. The real damage came from what happened next. The Soviet government lied. They downplayed the severity. They delayed the evacuation of nearby towns. They sent firefighters and workers into lethal radiation without adequate protection. They told the world and their own people that everything was under control, when everything was absolutely not under control.
Chernobyl did not just irradiate a landscape. It irradiated the Soviet government's credibility. For millions of Soviet citizens, it was the moment they stopped believing. If the state could lie about something this catastrophic, what else had it been lying about? The answer, of course, was almost everything. The truth was this: the Soviet Union had never been as strong as it looked. It was a giant, but a giant with feet of clay. Impressive from a distance, fragile at the core, built on a foundation of control, secrecy, and a version of reality that required constant maintenance to sustain. The collapse of 1991 did not begin in 1991. It began the moment the system chose appearance over reality and propaganda over reform. By the time a man named Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, the giant was already staggering, and what he did next would either save it or finish it. Mikhail Gorbachev was not supposed to be a revolutionary. He was a product of the Soviet system, born into it, educated by it, promoted through its ranks. He had spent his entire career inside the Communist Party, climbing slowly and carefully through the hierarchy, saying the right things to the right people at the right moments. By all appearances, he was exactly the kind of loyal, disciplined party man the system was designed to produce. But Gorbachev was different in one crucial way. He could see what others refused to see. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else at the top of the Soviet government, that the system was not working, that the gap between official reality and actual reality had become unsustainable, that without serious, fundamental change, the Soviet Union was heading toward a crisis it would not survive. He had grown up in rural southern Russia, in a family that had suffered directly under Stalin's collectivization campaigns. His grandfathers had both been arrested, one sent to a labor camp, the other interrogated and nearly executed. These were not abstract historical events for Gorbachev. They were personal, they were family, and they shaped in him a quiet but deep skepticism about the system he was serving, even as he rose through its ranks. When he became General Secretary of the Communist Party in March 1985, he was 54 years old, strikingly young by Soviet standards. The three men who had held the position before him, Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, had all died in office within a span of less than 3 years. The Soviet leadership had become a gerontocracy, a government of old, sick men clinging to power and refusing to confront reality. The joke at the time was that the Soviet Union's biggest export was state funerals. Gorbachev inherited a country in quiet but accelerating decay.
The economy was stagnant.
The economy was stagnant. The military was bleeding men and money in the mountains of Afghanistan. The bureaucracy was so bloated and so corrupt that basic government functions were barely functioning. Alcoholism had reached crisis levels. Life expectancy for Soviet men was actually falling, a phenomenon almost unheard of in a developed nation during peacetime. And the people, though they could not say it publicly, had largely stopped believing in the promises of communism. They went through the motions, they attended the party meetings, they repeated the slogans, but the faith was gone.
We cannot ignore this any longer. The time for action is now. We must unite and face this challenge.
2 landmark policies that would permanently alter the course of history and ultimately destroy the very system he was trying to save. The first was glasnost, a Russian word meaning openness. For the first time in Soviet history, glasnost allowed a degree of freedom of speech and freedom of the press that the system had never permitted before. Newspapers began publishing articles that criticized government policies openly and by name. Television programs aired investigations into Soviet failures, corruption at local government level, environmental disasters that had been hidden for years, the true cost of the Afghan war in human lives. Citizens were encouraged to speak openly about the problems they saw in their communities and their country. But perhaps most explosively, glasnost allowed historians and journalists to revisit chapters of Soviet history that had been buried, falsified, or simply declared off-limits for decades. The crimes of Stalin, the show trials, the gulags, the forced collectivization that killed millions through deliberate famine, the mass executions of the Great Purge began to be discussed openly in Soviet media for the first time. Families learned the true fates of relatives who had disappeared. Archives were opened. Survivors spoke. The scale of what had been hidden was staggering. Glasnost was intended to be a controlled opening, a way to let off steam, to identify problems, to build public trust in a reformed Soviet government. What it actually did was something far more powerful and far less controllable. It told the truth. And once the truth starts coming out, it is very difficult to put back. People who had spent their entire lives being told that the Soviet Union was a paradise for the working class suddenly had access to a different narrative. They could read about the failures. They could discuss the corruption openly in public spaces without fear of arrest. They could compare their lives to lives being lived in the West, and what they found was devastating. The gap between what they had been told and what was real
was a chasm.
not small. It
An
was not a
entire
minor
alternative
discrepancy.
history had
It was
been
a
hidden
chasm.
from them for
An
generations.
entire alternative history had been hidden from them for generations. The second policy was perestroika, meaning restructuring. Perestroika was Gorbachev's attempt to reform the Soviet economy without abandoning socialism. He wanted to introduce elements of market competition, decentralize some economic decision-making, reduce the suffocating weight of bureaucracy, allow a degree of private enterprise, and give individual enterprises more freedom to operate based on actual economic conditions rather than centrally dictated quotas. The goal was to make the economy more efficient, more honest, and more capable of sustaining the Soviet Union's position as a global superpower. But perestroika ran into a fundamental problem that Gorbachev had not fully anticipated and that no economist could have easily solved. You cannot partially reform a system that was designed to function only as a rigid, integrated whole. The Soviet economic system was not a flexible structure that could be adjusted piece by piece. It was an ecosystem, a deeply interconnected web of dependencies, subsidies, and centrally coordinated relationships that only worked in its dysfunctional way because every part of it operated under the same set of rules simultaneously. When you loosen central control without replacing it with a functional alternative, you do not get a better system. You get a system in transition that has lost its old logic but has not yet found a new one. State enterprises that had been kept alive by government subsidies suddenly faced new pressures they could not handle. Prices became unstable as market forces began to assert themselves in an economy that had no experience managing them. Supply chains, already fragile, broke down further as regional authorities began making decisions based on local interests rather than national coordination. Inflation appeared, a phenomenon that Soviet economic theory had declared impossible under socialism. The economy, instead of improving under perestroika, began to deteriorate even faster than before. Shortages that had been chronic became acute. Factories began laying off workers for the first time. The ruble lost value. The social contract that the Soviet government had maintained with its people, "We will not give you freedom, but we will give you stability and security," began to collapse. And there was another consequence of Gorbachev's reforms that proved even more dangerous than the economic chaos. He had woken something up. By giving people a voice, by allowing open discussion, by loosening the iron grip of censorship and political repression that had defined Soviet life since Lenin, Gorbachev had unleashed forces that had been suppressed for decades, in some cases for generations. Nationalism, ethnic identity, historical memory, the deep, unresolved grievances of peoples who had been absorbed into the Soviet Empire not by choice, but by force.
In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, movements for independence that had existed only in whispers, in private homes, in carefully coded language, began to speak loudly and openly. Massive human chains formed across the three countries. People sang songs that had been banned for 50 years. Flags that had been illegal to display were brought out of hiding. In Ukraine, in Georgia, in Armenia, in Moldova, in Azerbaijan, people began to ask questions that the Soviet system had spent decades making too dangerous to ask. Why are we part of this empire? What do we actually want? Who do we actually want to be? These were not abstract political questions. They were questions about identity, about history, about dignity. And Glasnost had given people both the permission and the vocabulary to ask them out loud. Gorbachev found himself in an impossible position. He had opened a door to allow fresh air into a suffocating room, and a storm had come through instead. He tried to hold the republics together through negotiation, through compromise, through the promise of a reformed union that would give them more autonomy without full independence. But for many, autonomy was no longer enough. The taste of freedom that Glasnost had given them had made the idea of remaining inside the Soviet Union feel intolerable. The great paradox of Mikhail Gorbachev is this. He was the most honest leader the Soviet Union ever produced. He saw the truth when others looked away. He tried to act on it when others chose comfortable denial. He genuinely believed that the Soviet system could be reformed, made more humane, more open, more functional, without being dismantled. And he paid the ultimate political price for that belief. The reforms he designed to save the Soviet Union became the mechanism of its destruction. He gave people freedom, and they used that freedom to walk away. By the late 1980s, the question was no longer whether the Soviet Union would change. The question was whether anything of it would survive at all. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was no longer slowly declining. It was actively unraveling. And the process was happening simultaneously on so many fronts, in so many places, that no government, however competent, however determined, could have contained it all. To understand how an empire of that size, that power, and that history came apart so quickly, you have to look at what was happening not just in Moscow, but across the entire vast geography of the Soviet world. Because the collapse of the USSR was not a single event, it was a chain reaction,
And like all chain reactions, it began with a spark. That spark came from the smallest republics in the empire. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the three Baltic states on the western edge of the Soviet Union, had never truly accepted Soviet rule. They had been independent nations between the two world wars, with their own governments, their own cultures, their own national identities. In 1940, they had been forcibly annexed by the Soviet Union under a secret agreement between Stalin and Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, an agreement whose very existence the Soviet government had denied for nearly 50 years. Under Glasnost, that denial was no longer sustainable. Soviet historians acknowledged the pact. The truth was out. And the truth changed everything. If the annexation of the Baltic states had been based on a secret deal with Nazi Germany, an illegal, immoral act hidden behind decades of Soviet propaganda, then what exactly was the legal basis for their continued membership in the USSR? The Baltic peoples asked this question loudly, publicly, and with a clarity that the Soviet government could not easily answer.
In August 1989, exactly 50 years after the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, nearly 2 million people across Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined hands to form a human chain, a living line of protest that stretched for nearly 700 kilometers across all three countries. They called it the Baltic Way. It was one of the most powerful acts of nonviolent resistance in modern history. It told Moscow and told the world that these people were not Soviet citizens who happened to live in the Baltics. They were Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, and they wanted their countries back. Moscow watched. Moscow was alarmed. But Moscow, under Gorbachev's reformist government, could not respond the way a previous Soviet leadership might have, with tanks and mass arrests. The age of brutal suppression, at least for the moment, appeared to be over. And that restraint, that inability or unwillingness to use overwhelming force, sent a message to every other restless republic in the Union. Resistance is possible. But the Baltic states were not the only place where the Soviet Empire was fracturing. In the Caucasus region, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, ethnic and territorial conflicts that had been frozen in place by Soviet authority for decades were thawing rapidly and violently. In 1988, Armenia and Azerbaijan went to war over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, a region with an Armenian majority that had been placed inside Soviet Azerbaijan by Stalin in the 1920s as a deliberate policy of divide and rule. As Soviet authority weakened, old wounds reopened. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. Massacres occurred on both sides. The Soviet military intervened but could not restore lasting order. In Georgia, the government declared sovereignty and began moving toward independence. Soviet troops responded with force in April 1989, killing 20 protesters in the capital Tbilisi with sharpened shovels, a brutality that shocked the Soviet public and further eroded Gorbachev's credibility both at home and abroad. In Ukraine, the second most populous Soviet republic and economically one of the most important, a powerful independence movement was gathering force. Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian language, Ukrainian history, all of which had been systematically suppressed under Soviet rule, were experiencing a dramatic revival. Millions of Ukrainians were discovering or rediscovering a national identity that decades of Soviet policy had tried to erase. And they were angry, not just about the present, but about the past, particularly about the Holodomor, the man-made famine of 1932 and 1933, in which Stalin's agricultural policies had killed an estimated 4 to 7 million Ukrainians. This was not ancient history. There were still people alive who remembered it, and Glasnost had finally allowed them to speak.
Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, the buffer zone of satellite states that the Soviet Union had controlled since the end of World War II, something extraordinary was happening. One by one, the communist governments that Moscow had imposed and sustained were falling, not through Soviet military intervention, but through popular revolution.
People were taking to the streets in numbers too large to be ignored, and governments that had ruled for decades were simply stepping aside. Poland led the way. The Solidarity movement, led by a shipyard electrician named Lech Walesa, had been fighting for workers' rights and political freedom since 1980. After years of suppression, it was legalized in 1989 and swept the first partially free elections in the communist bloc. A non-communist government took power in Poland for the first time since World War II. Hungary followed, opening its border with Austria and, in doing so, creating the first hole in the Iron Curtain. East Germans, who could not leave their country directly, began flooding through Hungary into the west by the tens of thousands. And then came the moment that more than any other single event announced to the world that the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe was finished. On the night of November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. For 28 years, the wall had been the most powerful symbol of the division between East and West, between freedom and repression, between two entirely different visions of how human society should be organized. It had been built to keep people in, to prevent the citizens of communist East Germany from walking away to a better life in the West. And on that November night, under pressure from massive street protests and a miscommunicated government announcement, the checkpoints were opened. East Germans walked through. They climbed over the wall. They embraced strangers on the other side. They wept. And then they started tearing the wall down with their own hands. The images were broadcast around the world, including into Soviet living rooms. For Soviet citizens watching on television, the message was impossible to misread. If the Berlin Wall could fall, if the communist governments of Eastern Europe could collapse peacefully in a matter of weeks, then nothing was permanent. Nothing was inevitable. Change was possible. The future was not fixed.
Inside the Soviet Union itself, the psychological impact was seismic. The belief that the Soviet system was unchangeable, that resistance was futile, that the empire was simply too powerful to challenge, that belief was dying. Republic after republic began passing declarations of sovereignty, asserting the primacy of their own laws over Soviet law. The legal architecture of the Union was being dismantled piece by piece, declaration by declaration, while Moscow looked on with growing helplessness. Gorbachev was caught in a trap of his own making. The openness he had introduced had made it politically impossible to respond with the kind of brute force that had suppressed previous challenges to Soviet authority. And yet, without force, he had no mechanism to stop the centrifugal forces tearing the Union apart. Negotiation required a willingness to compromise that many independence movements had moved beyond. They were no longer asking for more autonomy within the Soviet Union. They were asking to leave it entirely. The giant that had already been staggering was now falling, and the harder it tried to catch itself, the faster it seemed to go down. The empire was not being conquered from outside, it was imploding from within. 70 years of repression, falsification, forced unity, and deferred grievances were all coming due at the same time. And the worst was still to come. By the summer of 1991, the Soviet Union was a state in name only. Its authority had been challenged, its economy was in free fall, its republics were peeling away one by one, and its leader was trapped between reformers who thought he had not gone far enough and hardliners who believed he had already gone much too far. Gorbachev was trying to thread an impossible needle. He was negotiating a new Union treaty, a document that would have transformed the USSR from a centralized empire into a looser federation of sovereign states, each with significantly more autonomy than before. Several republics had agreed in principle to sign it. The signing was scheduled for August 20, 1991. The hardliners in the Soviet government, senior figures in the military, the KGB, and the Communist Party watched these negotiations with growing horror. To them, the new Union Treaty was not a reform, it was a surrender.
It was the dismantling of everything they had spent their lives defending. The Soviet Union they believed in, powerful, centralized, feared, was being negotiated away by a man they had come to regard as a traitor to the cause. They decided to act, and they chose the night before the treaty signing to do it. In the early hours of August 19, 1991, while Gorbachev was vacationing at his dacha on the Crimean coast, a group of 8 senior Soviet officials announced on state television that Gorbachev was ill and unable to perform his duties, and that power had been transferred to an emergency committee. It was, in plain language, a coup. The plotters included the vice president, the prime minister, the defense minister, the head of the KGB, and several other senior figures. These were not fringe actors. These were the men at the very top of the Soviet state. In Moscow, tanks rolled through the streets in the early morning darkness. Military units took up positions around key government buildings. State television replaced its normal programming with classical music and stiff official announcements. The message was familiar. This was how Soviet power had always reasserted itself. This was the playbook that had worked in Hungary in 1956, in Czechoslovakia in 1968. Overwhelming force, a compliant media, and the paralysis of any potential resistance. But 1991 was not 1956, and Moscow was not Budapest or Prague.
Something had changed. Glasnost had changed it. 6 years of open debate, of free press, of public political life had produced a population that was no longer willing to simply accept what it was told. When the tanks appeared in Moscow's streets, thousands of ordinary citizens came out to meet them not with weapons, but with their bodies. They surrounded the tanks. They argued with the soldiers. They built barricades around the Russian Parliament building, known as the White House, determined to defend it against any assault. And at the center of that resistance stood one man. Boris Yeltsin was the president of the Russian Republic, a position that, until recently, had been largely ceremonial. He had once been a Gorbachev ally, then a rival, then an opponent. He was larger than life, physically imposing, politically fearless, and utterly unafraid of confrontation. On the morning of August 19th, while the coup plotters were expecting compliance and silence, Yeltsin climbed on top of one of the tanks parked outside the Russian parliament and addressed the crowd directly. He declared the coup illegal. He called it a right-wing conspiracy against the legitimate government. He urged the Russian people and the Soviet military to resist. He stood there, in full view, on top of a tank, and dared the plotters to arrest him. It was one of the defining images of the 20th century, and it changed everything. The soldiers around him did not fire. They did not arrest him. Some of them, visibly moved, switched sides entirely, declaring that they would defend the parliament rather than assault it. The crowd around the White House grew by the hour. Hundreds of thousands of people flooded into central Moscow. Similar scenes unfolded in Leningrad, where the mayor openly defied the coup committee. In city after city across Russia, local governments announced their support for Yeltsin and their refusal to recognize the emergency committee's authority. The coup plotters had expected the population to be passive. They had expected the military to follow orders without question. They had expected the machinery of Soviet power, the same machinery that had crushed every previous challenge, to function as it always had. Instead, they found a society that had changed in ways they had failed to understand. The people were no longer afraid. Or rather, they were afraid, but they had decided that their fear was less important than their dignity.
Inside the coup committee, panic set in. The plotters had not planned for resistance. They had not planned for defection within their own military units. They had not planned for the international condemnation that came swiftly from Western governments. They had not planned for Yeltsin. On the evening of August 21st, just 3 days after the coup began, it collapsed entirely. The tanks withdrew from Moscow's streets. The coup leaders were arrested.
Several of them attempted suicide. One succeeded. Gorbachev flew back to Moscow from Crimea. He landed thinking he could resume his presidency, resume his reform agenda, resume the careful balancing act he had been performing for 6 years. But he landed in a different country than the one he had left. The coup had failed, but in failing, it had destroyed what little remained of Soviet authority. The Communist Party, the institution that had been the backbone of Soviet power for 7 decades, was suspended and then banned. Gorbachev himself suspended it. The organization that had built the Soviet state, that had survived Stalin, that had outlasted every challenge for 70 years, ceased to exist in a matter of days. And then the republics moved, fast. Estonia and Latvia declared full independence on August 20th and 21st, while the coup was still ongoing, seizing the moment of confusion and chaos to make the break permanent. Lithuania had already declared independence earlier that year. Within days of the coup's collapse, Ukraine, the most important republic after Russia itself, held a referendum on independence. Over 90% of Ukrainians voted to leave the Soviet Union. That result, more than any other single moment, made the survival of the USSR mathematically impossible. A Soviet Union without Ukraine was not a Soviet Union in any meaningful sense. One by one, the remaining republics followed: Belarus, Moldova, the Central Asian republics, the Caucasus. By the end of August, the map of the Soviet Union was dissolving in real time. Gorbachev found himself president of a country that no longer existed in any practical sense. He continued to negotiate, to propose new arrangements, to search for some formula that would keep some version of the Union together. But the moment had passed. The republics were gone, the party was gone, the authority was gone.
Boris Yeltsin, meanwhile, was ascending. As president of Russia, the largest and most powerful of the former Soviet republics, he was emerging as the dominant figure in the post-Soviet space. It was Yeltsin, not Gorbachev, who was making the decisions that mattered now. It was Yeltsin who was recognized by foreign governments as the man with real power. And it was Yeltsin who, along with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus, would deliver the final formal death certificate of the Soviet Union. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met secretly at a hunting lodge in the Belovezha forest and signed an agreement declaring that the Soviet Union no longer existed. They did not consult Gorbachev, they did not ask his permission, they simply announced as the leaders of the 3 founding Slavic republics of the USSR that the Union was dissolved and that in its place a new Commonwealth of independent states would be formed. Gorbachev learned about it after the fact. The coup that had been launched to save the Soviet Union had instead delivered its death sentence. The men who had sought to preserve the empire through force had, in 3 catastrophic days, destroyed the last remaining structures that were holding it together. They had given Yeltsin his defining moment. They had given the republics the justification they needed to leave without looking back. They had handed history exactly the opposite of what they intended. And now, all that remained was the formality of ending it.
December 25th, 1991. Christmas Day in the Western world, but in Moscow, there was no celebration. No lights, no festivity, no sense of joy. The city was cold, gray, and quiet in the way that cities sometimes get quiet when something enormous and irreversible is about to happen, as if the streets themselves understand that history is turning a page that will never be turned back. Mikhail Gorbachev had spent the previous weeks in a state of political agony. He had fought to the last to preserve some version of the Union he had tried to reform and save. He had proposed compromises, alternative frameworks, new formulas for coexistence. He had called foreign leaders, seeking support and recognition. He had argued, negotiated, pleaded. But the architecture of the Soviet Union had already collapsed around him. The republics were gone. The party was gone. The army had fractured. The economy was in ruins. He was a leader, without a country. On the evening of December 25th, Mikhail Gorbachev sat down in front of a television camera inside the Kremlin and delivered his resignation speech to the Soviet people and to the world. He spoke for 11 minutes. He did not rage, he did not weep, he did not blame his enemies or curse the men who had outmaneuvered him. He spoke with a kind of exhausted dignity, the dignity of a man who knows that history will judge him and who has made his peace with that judgment, whatever it turns out to be. He spoke about what he had tried to do, about glasnost and perestroika, about his belief that the Soviet Union could have been reformed rather than destroyed, about his conviction that the people of the former republics deserved freedom and self-determination, even as he mourned the union that had given them a common home. He acknowledged his mistakes. He expressed regret for the suffering that the period of transformation had caused. And then, at the end, with a quiet finality that carried the weight of 7 decades of Soviet history, he resigned the office of President of the Soviet Union, an office that, as of that moment, ceased to exist. He signed the papers. He set down his pen. And then he picked up the phone and called George H.W. Bush, the President of the United States, to inform him personally that the Soviet Union was finished. Bush, by his own later account, was somber. There was no triumphalism in that phone call, no celebration of American victory. There was instead a recognition of the magnitude of what had just happened, a recognition that the world had just fundamentally changed in ways that no one could yet fully understand. Shortly after Gorbachev's speech ended, a ceremony took place on the roof of the Kremlin that was watched by millions of people around the world on live television. The Soviet flag, the red banner with the golden hammer and sickle that had flown over the Kremlin since 1922, the flag of a state that had defined an entire century of human history, was lowered for the last time. Slowly, deliberately, it came down from the flagpole above the Grand Kremlin Palace, and in its place, the flag of the Russian Federation was raised, the tricolor, white, blue, and red, unfurled in the cold Moscow night air. It took less than a minute, 70 years of Soviet history, lowered on a flagpole in under 60 seconds. The soldiers who performed the ceremony did so with military precision and without visible emotion. But among the crowd watching below and among the millions watching on television screens across the former Soviet republics and around the world, the emotions were anything but controlled. In the Baltic states, people wept with joy. In Ukraine, crowds gathered in city squares, looking at screens and then looking at each other with an expression that seemed to say, "Is this real? Is it actually over?" In Russia itself, the reactions were more complicated, a mixture of relief, confusion, grief, and a deep uncertainty about what came next. For many Russians, the Soviet Union had not been a prison, it had been home. It had been identity. It had been the framework through which they understood themselves and their place in the world. And now it was simply gone. 300 million people went to sleep on the night of December 25, 1991, as citizens of the Soviet Union. They woke up on December 26th as citizens of 15 different countries. Countries that, in several cases, had not existed as independent states within living memory. Borders that had been internal administrative lines were now international frontiers. Currencies that had been the same were now different. Armies that had served the same flag were now serving 15 different ones. The logistical, political, and human consequences of that overnight transformation would take years, in some cases decades, to fully work through. Families found themselves separated by new international borders. Military officers woke up to find that their chain of command had ceased to exist. Scientists and engineers working on joint Soviet projects suddenly had no institution to report to. Pension systems, social safety nets, healthcare infrastructure, All of it had been organized around a state that no longer existed. And the nuclear arsenal, the most terrifying legacy of the Soviet state, the thousands of warheads that had defined the balance of global power for 40 years, was now distributed across 4 newly independent countries: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. The question of who controlled those weapons and what would happen to them became one of the most urgent security challenges in modern history. The world that woke up on December 26, 1991, was a fundamentally different world from the one that had existed the day before. The Cold War, the defining geopolitical framework of the second half of the 20th century, the contest between 2 superpowers and 2 visions of human society that had shaped every major international event since 1945, was over. Not with a bang, not with a war, but with an 11-minute speech, a signed piece of paper, and a flag coming down in the cold Moscow night. One empire, one decision, and the night that changed everything.
The Soviet Union did not fall because America defeated it. It did not fall because of one man's mistakes, or one bad policy, or one failed coup. It fell because it was built on a foundation that could not hold, a foundation of enforced silence, manufactured reality, and deferred truth. And when the truth finally came out, there was nothing underneath strong enough to survive it. Gorbachev wanted to save the system. Instead, he ended it. Yeltsin wanted to lead a new Russia. Instead, he inherited chaos. The coup plotters wanted to restore Soviet power. Instead, they buried it. Almost no one who shaped the events of those final years got what they actually wanted. History rarely works that way. 30 years later, the consequences of that December night are still unfolding. The NATO expansion that followed the Soviet collapse, the wars in Georgia, in Chechnya, in Ukraine, the rise of Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer who once called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and who has spent his entire presidency trying, in various ways, to reverse it. The Soviet Union is gone, but its ghost has never fully left. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of its collapse, that empires do not disappear cleanly. They leave behind borders drawn by force, identities suppressed for generations, and grievances that can survive for decades, waiting for the moment they become impossible to ignore any longer. One empire, one decision, and a night whose consequences the world is still living with today.